In the last video, we ended our journey in South Africa, a country that has probably done more than its fair share to convince people Africa belongs on the motorsport map. From legendary races to legendary circuits, South Africa built a reputation for speed. But today, we are not staying there. We are heading north. And somewhere along that road is a story that sounds like someone accidentally mixed up a motorsport history book with a travel brochure. Because when people think of classic racing cars, they usually imagine places like Goodwood, beautiful countryside, perfectly maintained grass, people wearing jackets that cost more than some cars, a very civilized way to appreciate very uncivilized machines. These are the cars that became legends. Cars that today are carefully preserved, admired, and occasionally driven by someone who looks like they need permission from a museum first. But there was a time when these machines weren't museum pieces. They weren't investments. They weren't something you politely admired behind a rope. They were race cars. And for a brief moment in history, some of them were racing in Nakuru, Kenya. Yes, Nakuru. The place you probably didn't expect to hear in the same sentence as Jaguar and Lotus, which is exactly why this story is interesting. Now, before we get to the circuit itself, there is one thing we need to understand. Kenya was never a stranger to motorsport. The obvious example is the Safari Rally, a race so brutal that finishing it was sometimes considered a victory by itself. The kind of event where the car wasn't just competing against other cars, it was competing against the road, the weather, and occasionally the decision-making abilities of whoever designed the suspension. This was the Kenya the world knew. Dust, gravel, long stages, mechanical survival. But there was another side to Kenyan motorsport, a side that didn't involve disappearing into the wilderness for hours at a time. Some drivers preferred their racing slightly more predictable, which is a very generous description of anything involving old race cars. They wanted proper racing circuits, starting grids, lap times, cars side by side fighting for every corner. And that meant Kenya needed somewhere for these machines to compete. The first attempt came from a place with a rather unusual background, a place called Langa Langa. Langa Langa is where this story gets a little strange, because it wasn't designed to create racing legends. It was designed for something much more practical. During the Second World War, the site was used as a military driver training area. The goal was simple: teach drivers how to handle heavy vehicles in difficult conditions. Basically, a place to learn how not to turn a truck into an expensive sculpture. But after the war ended, something happened that nobody on the original plans probably expected. People looked at a piece of infrastructure built for military training and thought, you know what this needs? Racing cars. Because apparently, giving enthusiasts a large piece of empty asphalt is one of the fastest ways to create a motorsport event. Soon, Langa Langa became a place where drivers could compete, spectators could watch, and machines that were never built to be ordinary could finally stretch their legs. It was the beginning of something bigger. But Langa Langa also showed the challenge of building a racing culture. You can create the passion, you can create the cars, but eventually you need a proper home. And Kenya was about to get one. In 1956, Kenya's circuit racing story entered a new chapter. Nakuru Park Motor Racing Circuit opened. And unlike Langa Langa, this wasn't just a place that happened to become a racetrack. This was built with racing in mind. A proper venue, a proper grid, a place where drivers could measure themselves against each other. And the cars that showed up were not exactly ordinary. Jaguar, Lotus, MG Cooper, Austin Healey, and Porsche. The same kinds of machines that today attract crowds at places like Goodwood were once arriving in Nakuru ready to be driven properly. And this is probably the strangest part. Nobody treated them like priceless historical artifacts. Nobody was standing there saying, please don't get a stone chip on the bonnet. This car is worth millions. because at the time, they weren't legends. They were just the fastest thing someone could afford to race. A Jaguar wasn't a museum piece, it was something you threw into a corner and hoped the person next to you had slightly worse brakes. That was the magic of Nakuru. For a brief moment, some of the world's most exciting racing machinery wasn't just being displayed, it was being used exactly as intended. For a while, Nakuru wasn't some forgotten footnote in motorsport history. It was the place to be. Drivers from across East Africa came here to compete. The paddock wasn't filled with multi-million-dollar hospitality seats and corporate branding. It was much simpler. Cars, tools, drivers, and probably someone confidently explaining why their setup was definitely faster than everyone else's. Because that part of motorsport has never really changed. Every era has someone who thinks they've discovered the perfect setup, and every era eventually proves them wrong. At Nakuru, saloon cars fought for position, sports cars attacked the corners, and motorcycles added their own version of controlled chaos. The circuit became a meeting point for people who didn't just like cars, they were slightly unreasonable about them. Which, to be fair, is usually how every great car culture begins. Nobody builds a community around being normal. For the spectators, it wasn't just about watching machines go around a track. It was about seeing technology, skill, and bravery collide in real time. The same reason people still travel to Goodwood today. Different location, different era, same obsession. And this is where the story takes an unfortunate turn. Because motorsports history is full of places that were once famous, and then somehow become a question people ask decades later. Nakuru Park was one of them. The strange thing is, the racing itself wasn't the problem. The passion was still there, the cars were still there, the drivers were still there. But motorsport needs more than enthusiasm. It needs space, money, maintenance, and occasionally someone willing to explain why a piece of land covered in tire marks is actually important. A difficult argument when everyone else sees empty real estate. As Kenya's motorsport identity became increasingly tied to rallying, especially the legendary Safari Rally, circuit racing slowly lost its spotlight. The world knew Kenya for endurance, survival, and conquering impossible roads. The circuit was a quieter story, and quieter stories are usually the ones history forgets first. By the 1980s, Nakuru Park's racing era was coming to an end. The track that once echoed with the sound of some of the world's most exciting racing machines was eventually replaced by the ordinary march of time, which is a slightly unfair ending for a place that once hosted cars people now travel across the world to see. The strange thing about history is that it doesn't always erase things completely. Sometimes it simply moves them somewhere else. Today, these cars are celebrated around the world at events like Goodwood. They are reminders of a different era of racing. But before they became icons, before they were collector pieces, before people started discussing their value more than their lap times, they were race cars. And for a brief moment, they were racing in Nakuru, Kenya, a place that most people will never put next to the world's great racing venues. But maybe that's what makes the story interesting. Because motorsport has always been about people who looked at something ordinary and decided it could do something extraordinary. A road became a rally stage, a military training ground became a racetrack, and a circuit in Nakuru became a temporary home for some of the most important racing cars ever built. So the next time you see one of these machines at Goodwood, remember that its story might not have started where you expected. Sometimes, history takes the scenic route. At this point, you're probably wondering how these stories keep appearing. Trust me, I'm asking the same question. One minute you're looking into a race, and the next you're discovering a forgotten chapter of motorsport history. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.